Banachtina Fela Podrigarov. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Who was St. Patrick? Is there anything we can know about the theology of St. Patrick? And what, if anything, can explain the peculiar hold that this figure, St. Patrick, has on the Irish imagination? Well, in this short video, I'm going to try and touch on these three things. My sources will be primarily his confession and his letter to Crodicus, the only surviving texts we have attributed to St. Patrick. Where there is any obvious historical refutation of anything he says, I'll mention it, but in general this will be a theological analysis. So, let's start. First of all, who was St. Patrick? According to his confession, St. Patrick, first of all, was taken as a slave to Ireland as a small boy. He wasn't at that stage a child of faith, so he tells us, but he came to faith to such an extent that after he was liberated from slavery, he went right back into the lion's den of pagan Ireland, this slave-ridden, blood-soaked culture, and proclaimed the gospel to them. He was an outsider. He was a lone ranger. He wasn't, as he tells it himself, an establishment man. Now, this, I think, perhaps slightly tainted by his theological idol, Paul. Paul is referenced time and again in the short writings we have from him. They are Paul-soaked. And Paul, of course, is an outsider. He thinks of himself as someone who is on the side of the vulnerable, someone who was led by God, led by the Holy Spirit, to preach this mission to the Gentiles. Indeed, he sees himself in fairly significant historical terms, because there's nothing beyond Ireland at this stage. The west coast of Ireland is the ends of the earth, and so if he preaches the gospel to the ends of the earth, pretty much second coming time. So he sees himself as this significant figure. This is what we can glean, and this is largely all we can glean from the primary sources. After that, we're talking about speculation. So let's get on with the next thing, which is perhaps slightly more interesting, which is, what is the theology that this Patrick is bringing? What is the theology that he's offering? One of my first academic jobs as a grad student was to be a tutor, was to be a kind of a teaching assistant who worked with a small group of students, maybe 10 or 11 students. This was in a course on very early Irish Christianity, and a lot of that was focused on Patrick. And the professor at the time, she was probably the leading scholar in this field at the time in Maynooth. She had me give my students this tiny little handbook, which was written by some Ulster Protestant loyalist zealot. And his argument was that St. Patrick was a Protestant, was a good Protestant. And for her, this was a way of sort of destabilizing the cultural Patrick that we inherit. Now, what really troubled me about this was that it was very close to true. Patrick's theology is extremely Pauline to the point of being, dare I say it, it's a kind of Lutheran. What we encounter is a theology whereby we have a largely useless human subject himself, who is elevated by the operation of the Holy Spirit alone to become capable of doing incredible things. There's no real sense that his nature is being raised up or cooperating with the Holy Spirit. He's moved wholesale by the Holy Spirit over to this land, and in this land there is a dichotomy. There is a black and white perspective where you have people who are living by the sword, who are very similar to what Nietzsche would talk about later on, where he says the strong are no more culpable in dominating the weak than an eagle is in swooping down upon its prey. Well, that's the way Ireland, in a sense, was at the time. There were bands of people who were, operating like a sort of mafiosa, who were running protection rackets, who were enslaving people, who were at war with each other in various factions. It was a very, very, very tough spot. And he sees himself bringing peace into this. And what kind of peace? A martyrdom kind of peace, that he will go there and he will be peaceful, he will proclaim the gospel, and if he is lucky, he will die. He will die a martyr. This is the sense that we have from the letter to Croticus, and also the sense that we have from his confession, that you have on the one side the law of the world, the law of violence, the law of the land. Again, this is a slave-soaked culture. This is a culture where, again, this is a caricature. But if you've seen, the Game of Thrones, when I read Patrick's letter to Croticus, I'm thinking, he's talking about the Dothraki here. He's talking about a mob that are running amok, enslaving and pillaging and raping and doing all these kinds of horrific things. And then you have those who are baptized and who wear these white shawls. And in the letter to Croticus he says, no sooner did the people that I baptized had their white robes on them than you cut them down in blood and you carry them off into slavery. And this is horrific. And so we get that sense, that radical binary in his theology, which is largely his way of thinking about the world. That the world is either going to be the Dothraki, or it's going to be this way of the Lamb, this absolute peacefulness, this love, this goodness, the kingdom of Christ, or the tyranny of violence and the play of violent forces as the only law of the land. That's how he sees it. Is this fair? Obviously most of us would instinctively say it's not fair, yet you will find very few good historical accounts that will portray early Ireland as anything else. There were tribes, there were clans, and there was very little capacity to see alternative tribes as having what we would call rights, that the spoils of these inter-clan conflicts were fair game as slaves, and that this was simply the way of it. You think later on of what's happening with with Vikings hordes coming across and raping and pillaging. Well, that's, in a sense, particularly the Irish cultural imagination, that's what the alternative is. That it is the way of turning the other cheek and peace and dying at these people's hands in an attempt to build a different world, or that. And so that's Patrick's theology, that without the Holy Spirit, without Christ, there is that. It's an extreme form of Pauline theology. His references, again, in the letter to Croticus and in the Confessions, are replete with quotations and references and phrases that he's encountered in Paul. Paul is his guy. This is, I think, one core part of it. This is the main part of it. The other part of it is that he is, whether he is a formalized bishop or not, he is what a bishop should be, in the sense that he is watching out for his flock. Now, his flock, so in his letter to Croticus, this is not simply written to the soldiers of Croticus, although it is, but it's written to everyone, people who would be able to see this juxtaposition and say, well, are we on the side of these soldiers, or are we on the side of these lambs? But it's also written, hopefully, to the authorities at Rome. He's basically accusing them of saying, look, you don't care about us. You think you're better than us. You look down on us because we're Irish. Therefore, we haven't got the education. We're not obviously Roman citizens. We're not part of the Pax Romana. We're outsiders and you don't care about us. Normally, when you have people, when you have missionaries going out to foreign lands, you send them with a few soldiers so that they can free, slaves that have been made and release them, and they can offer protection. You give me nothing because you don't care about us. This is, I think, something which also comes through a lot. Yes, he's having a savage go at Croticus, and he's having a savage go at Croticus' soldiers, and he's having a savage go at those who would not do anything to help protect these lambs as he sees it. But part of these people who aren't protecting these lambs are the authorities in Gaul, or the authorities in the church in general. So he's someone who sees a very, very black and white world, someone who sees the power of the Holy Spirit and indeed grace as the medicine which heals a body which otherwise would be hell-bent on following the pleasures of the flesh towards raping, pillaging, etc. And he also is someone who has a sense of what the church is and what the role of a leader in the church is in terms of taking the side of his lambs who are being enslaved, who are being violated, the women and the lowly. Okay, so that is, a brief introduction to his theology. Why does he capture the imagination of Irish people to the extent that he does? St. Patrick is an Irish saint in a couple of different ways that I think catch the Irish imagination. One, he's clearly an adversarial sort. And what I mean by this is, and I don't want to give in to pugilistic stereotypes of Irishness, but he's having a go at, again, as we mentioned before, Croticus, the men of violence. He's having a go at the authorities in Rome. He's having a go at people. Who are you to look down on us? We're the outsiders. We're out here at the edge of the earth, trying to do the right thing, and you're not giving us respect. You look down on us. You think you're better than us. And this is something which I think will definitely helps explain his enduring fascination to Irish people who, in various, turns of the centuries, find themselves in this position. Who are you to look down on us? Why are you looking down on us? You think you're better than us, don't you? This is the constant refrain for the 700 years of English occupation. It's even, I think, before that maybe a refrain that the Irish will use at times when they're being brought to heel by the Roman Church. Now, I'm not going to go into that whole Celtic spirituality industry, which is completely overblown and completely unsupported by sources, but there's still an element where we are different. We're not the products of a sort of a Romanized basis. We're outside that pale, and therefore you think you're better than us. Well, you're not better than us, and here's why. And so this, I think, is one of the reasons why Patrick has cachet with the Irish psyche. Patrick also has cachet. He positions himself as an outsider. He is more Paul than Peter. He is the apostle to the Gentiles rather than the company man. This, I think, is something which gives him a resonance, and so too then Patrick is the originator. Patrick is the foundation story of Irish Christianity. This is not a story of conquest or anything like it. It's not that Christianity was brought here by an invading army or men in ships. Christianity was brought here by a slave that we enslaved. That's really important. That's really important in terms of shifting the psyche. That in Ireland, Christianity could never really be seen as an external imposition. I'm sure pagans would have seen it as an imposition to an extent, although no more than many of the pagan religions in Germania or in Frankish lands were they were fine with syncretism. They were fine with, oh yeah, another God. Cool, more the merrier, And so there's no real clash in that same extent. And Christians who are telling pre-Christian stories, we think of the story of Usheen, which it kind of becomes the story of Columkill. We think of other stories, Bridget, that whole thing. There's a kind of it's Christian now. It's a kind of an organic thing. And so it's never an imposition from without, because it comes through the speech of a slave boy who's a kind of one of us, and who looks out for us and loves us and defends us against these people who look down on us, and defends us against these thugs who are brutalizing us. And so from the very start, Christianity, and then later on after the Reformation, Catholicism, is understood as our thing eternally, that it was never not our thing. This is kind of, we evolved into this. It never vanquished what went before. And there's this a kind of and think of so many myths and stories. You might think of the children of Lir, stories which do an amazing job in capturing this movement. The children of Lir, of course, and I want to keep this short, so I'm not going to get into the entire story of the children of Lir. But basically, they get made into swans for centuries, and then they come back, and it's now a Christian Ireland. And they come back, and now they can die and go to heaven and of all that good stuff. And there's a sense of loss and a sense of missing, but it's also a sense of loss and missing which is overwhelmed by the good things that have been gained, which even outweigh the stuff that's been lost. And so the culture tells these stories as a way of navigating these shifts, I think, in a way which is far more helpful than in many other places, of course, where Christianity and other religions, Islamic North Africa, Islamic Turkey, Christian, the Americas, which comes through and via conquest. So that's perhaps some of the reasons why Patrick is so potent as a cultural signifier and has captured the Irish imagination to the extent that Patrick has. Read the Letter to Crodicus, read his confession. Give it an hour, you'll read everything he's written. You'll have as much of a sense of who Patrick is as I do. And what you'll find is a very, very orthodox, very, very traditional, very, very typical Pauline theology. Thanks for watching. Banachtina Fela Fodrig Dave. Have a good day.